On September 1st, 1939, German mechanized columns tore into Poland, dragging the globe into a terrifying new era of industrialized warfare. On that exact day, General George C. Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He inherited a geographically isolated force of roughly 174,000 men, ranking 19th in the world, smaller than Portugal's army. This underfunded constabulary still relied heavily on horses, wooden barracks, and vintage rifles. By every contemporary military calculation, transforming this obsolete relic into a global juggernaut before the Axis locked down Europe and Asia was mathematically impossible. It looked exactly like the setup for an inevitable national disaster. Averting that disaster would require a completely different kind of warfare. The narrative of the American victory is rarely told as an administrative thriller, yet that is exactly what it was. Long before a single tank could roll across a European battlefield, someone had to figure out how to invent a modern military from absolute scratch. The central puzzle was staggering. How do you draft, house, and arm an 8 million strong fighting force while the global clock is rapidly running out? How do you simultaneously build transoceanic supply chains, rewrite obsolete combat doctrines, and elevate a completely new generation of commanders without the entire bureaucracy collapsing under its own sudden weight? This was not merely a test of inherent national bravery, but a brutal equation of industrial and organizational survival. But before this unprecedented war-winning weapon could be forged, the architects of mobilization faced a paralyzing reality. To understand how the greatest military machine in history was built, we must first look at the massive domestic roadblocks that stood in the way of even turning the ignition. Turning the ignition meant facing a hostile Congress that had spent the previous 2 decades ensuring the United States would never again bleed on foreign soil. In late 1939 and early 1940, Capitol Hill was a fortress of isolationism. The trauma of the First World War remained fresh, and a series of neutrality acts legally chained the country to strict non-intervention. General George C. Marshall found himself repeatedly walking into wood-paneled committee rooms, facing skeptical politicians who viewed military expansion as a direct provocation. He was demanding a fundamental shift in the American mindset. Every request for modernized artillery or expanded base facilities was met with grueling interrogations. Legislators questioned why the Army needed massive funding when 2 oceans supposedly provided impenetrable barriers against the mechanized slaughter consuming Europe. But the resistance was not just political, it was deeply structural. The American industrial base, the very engine that would eventually crush the Axis powers, was completely uncalibrated for military production. In 1939, Detroit was churning out millions of civilian automobiles, while the Army struggled to source basic motor transport. Factories were optimized for washing machines and refrigerators, not the precision machining required for heavy ordnance or aviation engines. Transitioning an entire capitalist economy from peace to war without wartime executive powers was an agonizingly slow process. Tooling up assembly lines for tanks and artillery took months, if not years, of lead time. Marshall watched the clock ticking with suffocating pressure. As German panzers redefined the speed of conquest, the United States Army was still drafting blueprints for weapons it had no immediate capacity to build en masse. Time was the one resource Congress could not appropriate, and it was rapidly slipping away. To build a force capable of modern warfare, Marshall first had to secure the manpower, requiring him to cross the ultimate political minefield, the first peacetime conscription in American history. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 sparked bitter nationwide debates. Opponents argued that a peacetime draft was the hallmark of a totalitarian state, fundamentally at odds with American liberty. Marshall spent exhausting hours testifying, projecting a cold, nonpartisan logic. He did not use emotional appeals. Instead, he presented raw, undeniable mathematics regarding the defense of the Western Hemisphere. The bill finally squeezed through Congress in September 1940, passing by a perilously narrow margin, with its later extension surviving by just a single vote. Suddenly, the military was legally guaranteed an influx of hundreds of thousands of conscripts. Yet, securing manpower immediately triggered an equally dangerous internal crisis. The recruits were arriving, but the men tasked with leading them were products of a profoundly obsolete system. The interwar army had been paralyzed by peacetime stagnation, where promotion was dictated entirely by rigid seniority rather than tactical competence. It was a culture that inadvertently rewarded bureaucratic survival over military innovation. Field-grade officers and division commanders were often men in their late 50s or 60s, many of whom had not commanded large troop formations since the trenches of 1918. Their mental frameworks were anchored to the static, infantry-centric doctrines of a bygone era. They severely lacked the mental flexibility, physical stamina, and operational speed required for the mechanized, combined arms warfare currently being demonstrated by the Wehrmacht. Marshall knew that sending millions of young Americans into global combat under the command of intellectually rigid, physically exhausted officers would result in a catastrophic slaughter. He needed to ruthlessly purge the dead wood and elevate a new generation of commanders, men who understood logistics, motorized speed, and modern communications. But firing senior officers in an entrenched peacetime bureaucracy was politically toxic. The military machine was trapped in a paradox. It finally possessed the raw materials, but lacked the managerial software to operate them. With the peacetime draft enacted, the clock accelerated. Trainloads of draftees from farms, factories, and cities began pouring into hastily constructed, muddy cantonments across the country. They were wearing surplus uniforms, carrying wooden rifles, and looking for leadership. This massive, untrained civilian influx desperately needed capable officers and a coherent modern doctrine before they could even be considered a functioning military force. They were heading straight toward their very first large-scale field test, an unprecedented organizational experiment that would rip away the illusions of peacetime planning and reveal a terrifying reality about the actual state of American combat readiness. That field test commenced in the late summer of 1941 across the sweltering pine forests and swamps of the American South. The Louisiana Maneuvers deployed nearly 500,000 men across 3,400 square miles of terrain. It was the largest peacetime war game in United States history, and it became an immediate, highly visible operational disaster. The glaring equipment shortages were humiliatingly public. Reporters photographed soldiers using broomsticks for machine guns, lengths of stovepipe to represent mortars, and commercial delivery trucks with the word tank crudely painted on their doors. But the missing hardware was merely a symptom of a much deeper institutional rot. The maneuvers brutally exposed systemic, catastrophic failures in command. Convoys created 50-mile traffic jams. Supply lines collapsed, leaving entire divisions stranded without food or fuel for days. Radio networks broke down, forcing units to rely on physical messengers who promptly got lost in the bayous. Most alarmingly, the exercises revealed the staggering tactical blindness of the old guard. Senior commanders, still mentally entrenched in 1918, tried to fight static, linear battles. They ignored simulated air support, failed to deploy anti-tank screens, and were repeatedly outflanked by the few motorized cavalry units present. Umpire reports confirmed what Marshall had feared. In a genuine clash with German panzers, these American divisions would be systematically annihilated. Rather than suppressing these embarrassing results, Marshall weaponized the failure. He used the highly publicized chaos to justify a ruthless administrative slaughter. In the weeks that followed, he effectively purged the Army's hierarchy, forcing the retirement, demotion, or reassignment of hundreds of overaged colonels and generals who had failed the test of modern maneuver warfare. To fill the vacuum, Marshall bypassed strict peacetime seniority and reached deep down the roster. He elevated relatively unknown middle-ranking officers who had demonstrated speed, adaptability, and logistical brilliance in the Louisiana mud. Among them was an obscure officer who had expertly managed the sprawling operational plans of the Third Army, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Alongside him rose other pragmatic innovators, like Omar Bradley. Marshall had successfully amputated the dead weight from the upper echelons, installing a lean, aggressive leadership corps capable of commanding a mechanized force. But his timeline was terrifyingly short. The dust from the Louisiana Maneuvers had barely settled when the calendar turned to December 1941. The luxury of theoretical exercises vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate two-front reality. The shockwave of December 7th shattered any remaining political resistance. Overnight, the agonizingly slow peacetime buildup was violently accelerated into the largest bureaucratic mobilization in human history. The selective service system, once carefully meting out drafts in politically palatable increments, suddenly ripped open the floodgates. Local draft boards in every county in America began processing millions of men. But conscripting a man is merely a legal transaction. Turning a civilian into a combat-ready soldier is a massive, heavily industrialized process. The immediate crushing friction of this sudden scale threatened to break the War Department before a single shot was fired in Europe. The first crisis was not weaponry, but real estate and basic human infrastructure. You cannot draft 3 million men if you have nowhere to put them. The Army Corps of Engineers embarked on a frantic, nationwide construction program, throwing up sprawling training cantonments across the country at a speed that defied traditional logic. Giant facilities practically grew out of the dirt in weeks. These were not mere tent city encampments. They were instant, fully functioning metropolises, requiring their own dedicated power grids, water treatment plants, rail spurs, and hospital networks. But the sheer volume of human intake generated endless administrative chaos. Trainloads of draftees from farms and inner cities were arriving at classification centers at all hours of the day and night. They had to be medically evaluated, inoculated, issued uniforms that actually fit, and fed 3 times a day. The logistical burn rate was staggering. Quartermasters were suddenly ordering boots and wool blankets by the tens of millions, discovering that peacetime supply chains were entirely incapable of handling this violent surge in demand. It was a daily, grinding battle against friction. Men arrived before their barracks were finished. Units were formed before they had mess kits. Training schedules were drafted before the instructors even understood the new field manuals. Yet the brutal, factory-like process of receiving, sorting, and housing the American male population ground forward through the mud of 1942. To arm this rapidly expanding sea of uniforms, the American civilian economy had to be entirely and violently reformatted. The hesitant, partial conversions of the pre-war years were replaced by a total, synchronized industrial mobilization, coordinated by the War Production Board. Marshall and the military brass worked relentlessly with civilian agencies to strong-arm the nation's manufacturing base into submission. The resulting miracles were not achieved through patriotic magic, but through ruthless standardization and the brutal efficiency of the assembly line. Automotive giants in Detroit completely halted the lucrative production of civilian cars. Their vast stamping presses and precision machine shops were rapidly retooled to churn out M4 Sherman tanks and heavy aircraft engines. Every sector of the economy was cannibalized for the war effort. Typewriter factories began manufacturing machine guns. Toy companies produced compasses. The scale of output required an entirely new approach to manufacturing. The defining symbol of this era was not just the tank, but the Liberty ship. Built in modular, prefabricated sections across dozens of coastal shipyards, these vital cargo vessels were welded together with unprecedented speed. The construction time for a single ship plummeted from over 200 days to, in some astonishing cases, less than a single month. But manufacturing the weapons was only the first half of the equation. Moving them was the second and far more complex challenge. The American rail network groaned under the weight of continuous, heavy military transport. Millions of tons of steel, rubber, and high explosives had to be meticulously synchronized to arrive at eastern and western seaports exactly as the newly built cargo ships were ready to load them. A delay of 24 hours at a rail yard in Chicago could mean a missed convoy in New York, which in turn meant a tank division in North Africa went without its replacement artillery shells. The bureaucratic machinery required to track, schedule, and route this tidal wave of materiel was managed by an expanding army of clerks and logisticians. Even with industry roaring to life, Marshall faced a mathematical crisis that threatened to stall the entire military machine. The sheer size of the administrative, logistical, and communications tail required to support a global war was bleeding the combat units dry. Every man assigned to a switchboard, a supply depot, or a motor pool was a man who could not be handed an M1 Garand and sent to the front lines. To solve this paralyzing administrative drain, Marshall pushed for a radical, highly controversial solution: the formal integration of women into the military structure. Against fierce resistance from conservative politicians and deeply entrenched military traditionalists, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later the Women's Army Corps, was established. This was not a symbolic gesture of equality. It was a cold, pragmatic military necessity. Marshall understood that modern war was largely a war of administration and technical precision. Women stepped directly into vital roles as radio operators, mechanics, cryptographers, air traffic controllers, and supply logisticians. They mapped weather patterns for bombing raids and managed the immense, complex filing systems that kept the global supply chains moving. Their integration directly freed up the equivalent of several full combat divisions. The military hierarchy, initially deeply skeptical, quickly realized that the WACs were frequently more efficient and disciplined in these technical and administrative roles than the men they replaced. It was a fundamental shift in the operational capacity of the Army, proving that the massive mobilization was tapping into every available resource the nation possessed to overcome the friction of scale. The true terror of this expansion, however, was geographic. The United States was attempting something no empire in history had ever successfully managed: projecting and sustaining massive, mechanized military force across two separate oceans simultaneously. The friction of distance was immense. Marshall was not just building an army for a single concentrated front. He was constructing a global distribution network. In the Pacific, supply lines stretched for thousands of miles across hostile waters to reach isolated garrisons in Australia and the South Pacific. In the Atlantic, the challenge was even more daunting. The United States was not only feeding and arming its own rapidly expanding forces in Britain and North Africa, but it was also serving as the primary logistical artery for the Soviet Union and the British Empire. The coordination required was mind-bending. Every single shipping convoy had to be meticulously loaded. You could not simply fill a ship with rifles. You needed the exact mathematical ratio of ammunition, spare parts, medical supplies, and rations. A division arriving in a foreign theater without its designated maintenance battalions or its specialized radio equipment was effectively useless in combat. The newly constructed Pentagon became a 24-hour processing engine of global logistics. Marshall and his staff lived in a world of shipping tonnages, rail capacities, and port turnaround times. They were fighting a daily, exhausting war against the limits of physics and geography, trying to push millions of men and tens of millions of tons of steel through the narrow bottlenecks of global ports. The sheer friction of moving a single armored division from a training camp in Texas to a staging area in England involved thousands of individual bureaucratic actions, any one of which could derail the entire operational timeline. Half a world away, the architects of the Axis powers watched this chaotic awakening with a fatal mixture of arrogance and fundamental misunderstanding. In the early months of 1942, military intelligence in both Berlin and Tokyo analyzed the American mobilization and drew entirely the wrong conclusions. Their intelligence officers looked at the political noise of the American system, the labor strikes, the loud congressional debates, the journalistic freedom, and saw only fatal weakness. German high command, deeply embedded in a militaristic, authoritarian culture, assumed that a fractured, decadent democracy was biologically incapable of sustaining a total war economy. They openly mocked the American effort. To the inner circles of the Third Reich, the United States was a nation of refrigerator makers, businessmen, and jazz musicians, utterly lacking the martial spirit and national discipline required for a sustained, bloody conflict. They believed the inherent bureaucratic sluggishness of a capitalist democracy would prevent it from ever translating its raw industrial potential into effective, disciplined combat divisions on a European battlefield. Japanese intelligence shared a similar fatal conceit, heavily banking on the assumption that the politically divided American public lacked the psychological endurance for a long, grinding war of attrition in the Pacific. They believed the initial shock of their offensives would force a negotiated settlement before the American industrial machine could fully wake up. But as 1942 bled into 1943, the tone in the intelligence briefs began to shift dramatically. The mocking dismissal slowly curdled into a quiet, creeping anxiety. Spies and neutral observers began transmitting production numbers that seemed completely fabricated. The Abwehr intercepted reports of heavy bombers rolling off assembly lines, not by the dozens, but by the thousands. They received verified intelligence of massive, newly built shipyards launching cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could theoretically sink them. The Axis intelligence apparatus was built to understand traditional military metrics: battleships, standing armies, fortified borders. They were entirely unequipped to comprehend the terrifying geometry of compound industrial growth. When German analysts finally began to grasp the true scale of the American supply chains stretching across the Atlantic, the reality of their miscalculation dawned on them. They were not fighting a traditional army. They were fighting a continent-sized factory that had suddenly achieved sentience and was weaponizing every ounce of its steel, oil, and manpower. The internal memos circulating in Berlin and Tokyo grew increasingly frantic, reflecting the delayed, horrifying recognition of the unstoppable industrial tidal wave they had unleashed. They realized, far too late, that the American bureaucratic friction they had initially laughed at was merely the sound of a massive, gears-grinding transition. Once engaged, the system possessed a ruthless, mechanized momentum that was entirely immune to Axis ideology. To the Axis powers, and indeed to the American public watching the endless newsreels of tanks rolling off assembly lines and fresh-faced troops marching onto transport ships, the mobilization appeared infinite. It looked like an unstoppable, unlimited juggernaut, a bottomless well of industrial might that could easily overwhelm any obstacle through sheer volume alone. But this image of boundless capacity was a carefully maintained illusion. The reality of the two-front global war was consuming the nation's capacity faster than anyone had anticipated. Behind closed doors in the War Department, stripped of the patriotic propaganda and the comforting statistics of industrial output, General George Marshall was staring at a terrifying strategic deficit. The global commitments were too vast, the oceans too wide, and the logistical tail far too heavy. He realized that the United States could not actually build the massive, overwhelming army it originally thought it needed without completely collapsing the civilian economy that was supplying it. Faced with this mathematical impossibility, Marshall was forced to make a chilling, highly controversial compromise, one that would fundamentally alter the structure of the American military and place an almost unbearable burden on the men who were about to do the fighting. That compromise became known as the 90-division gamble. Initially, War Department planners calculated that defeating the Axis would require a massive ground force of over 200 combat divisions. But Marshall looked at the global ledger and made a ruthless cut. He capped the army at an astonishingly low 90 divisions, a fraction of the forces fielded by Germany or the Soviet Union. The logic was a cold calculation of industrial survival. Drafting the millions of additional men required for a massive army would strip domestic factories of their critical workforce. The assembly lines supplying Britain, the Soviet Union, and the expanding Pacific Fleet would inevitably collapse. A machinist could not simultaneously hold a rifle in Europe and rivet a heavy bomber in Detroit. To win the war of global production, the Army had to fight with significantly less manpower. To compensate, this compact force was heavily mechanized and backed by an overwhelming synchronized artillery network. But the human cost of this organizational decision was immense. With only 90 divisions spread across multiple global theaters, the United States possessed almost no strategic reserve. For the combat soldier, this meant a terrifying reality. There was no unit rotation. Once an American infantry division entered the line, it stayed in continuous, grueling combat. Units had to absorb their casualties and rely on a steady stream of individual replacements, while the core of the division fought on without relief. Men were forced to remain in the meat grinder until the war ended, or until they physically and psychologically broke. This fragile equation of balancing factory output against human endurance worked perfectly well on paper. But in the freezing winter of late 1944, a massive, unexpected enemy counterattack would push this exact limitation to its absolute breaking point. On the morning of December 16, 1944, out of the dense, freezing fog of the Ardennes forest, over 200,000 German troops and 1,000 panzers slammed into a thinly held sector of the American front. The Battle of the Bulge instantly exposed the terrifying vulnerability of Marshall's 90-division gamble. The sheer violence of the surprise offensive tore a massive hole in the Allied lines. And exactly as planners had feared, there was no strategic reserve waiting in the rear to plug the gap. Every combat division was already committed or exhausted. The mathematical edge of the American military was instantly pushed to the point of catastrophic collapse. With panzer columns racing toward vital fuel depots and crossroads, the American command structure was forced into desperate improvisation. Because the combat infantry was fully absorbed, the defense fell to the massive logistical and administrative tail that Marshall had spent 5 years building. Quartermasters, motor pool mechanics, switchboard operators, and mess hall cooks were abruptly handed M1 Garins and ordered into the freezing snow to hold critical intersections. They were facing elite, combat-hardened German armored formations. On paper, this ad hoc assembly of rear echelon personnel should have been effortlessly swept aside, but they did not break. The survival of the Allied front in those chaotic first days did not hinge on the brilliant maneuvering of a single famous general, but on the relentless standardization drilled into the Army since the Louisiana Maneuvers. A mechanic knew how to operate a bazooka. A clerk understood basic squad tactics. A junior officer cut off from headquarters knew how to organize a defense without waiting for higher orders. The rigid, top-down paralysis that plagued the pre-war Army had been entirely bred out of the newly minted officer corps. Simultaneously, the vast logistical machinery shifted gears with terrifying speed. Supply officers frantically rerouted thousands of transport trucks, moving entire divisions hundreds of miles overnight through freezing rain, backed by a constant stream of ammunition rolling straight from American factories to the European winter. When the German offensive finally stalled, starved of fuel and shattered by overwhelming synchronized artillery, it became clear that the American line had not been saved by a sudden, inexplicable miracle. It held because the sheer resilience of the administrative and logistical machine, meticulously constructed from the ground up since 1939, was finally capable of absorbing the ultimate blow. When the smoke finally cleared over the Ardennes, the ghost of the United States Army of September 1939 was officially laid to rest. In just over 5 years, that geographically isolated constabulary of barely 174,000 men, an underfunded relic reliant on horses and vintage rifles, had been completely erased from existence. It was replaced by a synchronized global organism that fundamentally changed how wars would be fought forever. America's true military triumph was certainly paid for in blood in the snowdrifts of Europe and the volcanic ash of the Pacific, but it was entirely engineered in the fluorescent-lit corridors of the Pentagon and on the deafening factory floors of Detroit. This was a war won by blueprints, shipping tonnages, and the relentless efficiency of the assembly line. The Allied success was driven by a meticulously constructed system that married raw human capital with unimaginable industrial might, effectively standardizing victory. It proved, with terrifying finality, that modern global conflicts are no longer won merely by the courage of the individual soldier. Courage alone cannot ship tens of millions of tons of steel across 2 hostile oceans. And bravery cannot simultaneously clothe, feed, and arm an 8 million man force from absolute scratch. The Axis powers were ultimately crushed by an unprecedented administrative equation, a ruthlessly organized machine that simply overwhelmed their capacity to destroy it. And sitting at the absolute center of this sprawling, bureaucratic miracle, the man who forced a reluctant nation to build the impossible was an architect whose defining truth was forever embedded in the system he created. General George C. Marshall did not merely assemble an army capable of fighting the Second World War. By ruthlessly stripping away the stagnation of peacetime and forging a cold, calculated alliance between military command and civilian manufacturing, he constructed the definitive logistical machine of the 20th century. He engineered a reality where the sheer expanse of American geography and the raw output of its industrial assembly lines were successfully weaponized, creating an unstoppable force that permanently rewrote the brutal mathematics of modern warfare.